One of the great things that architecture can do is give us a sense of belonging, a feeling of fitting into an environment. I'm David Macaulay. I studied architecture at Rhode Island School of Design, the other college on the hill. Even though I was never a Brown student, over the years of living in Providence and walking around these streets, I've developed a real fondness for the collection of buildings that make up the Brown campus.
Some of the books that I've written and illustrated have looked at grander kinds of architecture: castles, cathedrals, skyscrapers, pyramids. But what I like about Brown's buildings is their human scale, their accessibility. Architecturally, with its buildings from different periods and different styles, the campus reminds me of an extended family, a collection of sometimes quirky individuals held together by affection and a shared history. Part of its appeal for me is that Brown's campus, like the best kind of education, embraces contradictions. It can be both familiar and surprising, grand and intimate, uniform and diverse at the same time. It's one of the most remarkable collections of college buildings in the country, and it didn't happen by accident. Brown has invested a great deal in shaping this invaluable architectural environment, a unique legacy that embodies much of the university's history. And although a student may not realize it at the time, Brown's buildings are a real part of the learning that goes on here. Even an outsider can feel that. Take University Hall. Here it is, for the first time, an architectural doodle probably sketched during a dull corporation meeting by Brown's first president, James Manning. Remembering Nassau Hall at Princeton, his alma mater, he probably asked Robert Smith, the designer of that building, to come to Providence to plan this college edifice. In those first years, students studied, ate, and slept under this one roof.
University Hall has been remodeled so many times that there's almost nothing left of the original colonial interior. Outside, however, all the charm is real. Though it was built during troubled times in the colonies, University Hall speaks of the certainties of the Georgian world, a time of rectitude and order.
The architect did play one trick, though. Each floor is set back from the one beneath it, ever so slightly, by only one brick. It's a subtle, almost subliminal touch. The building falls away from us as it rises, so it seems taller and grander. It's remarkable that for 50 years, University Hall was the only building at Brown. It's even more remarkable that in over 200 years, nothing has dislodged this simple building from its place as the architectural center of the Brown campus. Its simple design and its humble materials set the standard for what came next.
The Brown brothers had given the land for the university's first building and supervised its construction. When Nicholas Brown Jr. came to finance the second building, he was only competing with himself. He named it after his sister, Hope.
Hope College is almost a mirror image of University Hall, in more formal clothes. University Hall's soft brick gives way to hard brick. The earlier building's feeling of having been put together by its carpenters is replaced by a more rational facade. Otherwise, Hope College continues the lines and scale of its predecessor. The brick surface and the similar window patterns of the two buildings create a continuity that allows the eye to bridge the gap between them. University Hall and Hope College are utilitarian buildings of their time, but in 1834, Nicholas Brown filled the gap between them with something completely different. Manning Hall is the boldest building on the front campus, a brick and stucco evocation of a Greek temple. Classical Greek revival forms were all the rage, of course, in the first decades of the 19th century, often used for buildings with a public function, like churches and libraries. In Brown's case, Manning Hall combined both. Upstairs was the college's chapel, and downstairs, the reason for the building's grand form, was the new library. Perhaps more directly than other kinds of architecture, Greek revival buildings are expressions of an idea in brick and mortar. These forms were meant to connect what happened inside the buildings to the ideals of ancient Greece. Looking back to the classical world, they looked forward to what the United States hoped to become.
What a sweet example of Greek Revival architecture. And what a magisterial setting. In scale with its neighbors and dramatically sited on the crest of the hill, Manning is a marvelous theatrical punctuation between the quiet brick forms of University Hall and Hope College. With them, it began to form a grand wall, a wall of buildings. And the secret behind that wall? What took shape there was what we know today as the College Green.
One of its charms is that there is no formal entrance to it. One enters from the corners or from the sides, emerging into the space between the buildings that define it. The result is always a sense of surprise, a different experience each time. The green allows itself to be discovered and rediscovered.
The proportions feel right, maybe because it's almost a double square. It's a large space, but it's not so big that it loses its sense of enclosure. From one end, for example, you can just about recognize somebody at the other.
Within it, the trees create new sightlines, breaking up the space into human scale again. The whole effect is surprisingly intimate. It feels like a living room outdoors. And no matter what has happened elsewhere on the Brown campus, no building on the green has been replaced or removed. Interiors have been remodeled, but every architectural facade here is original. Another reason the space works is that the centers and ends of the green are held by strong buildings. At the north end, of course, is Faunce House, designed by McKim, Mead & White, the nation's preeminent architects at the turn of the century. John D. Rockefeller donated the money for the main building, and his son financed the addition with its graceful arched entryway, with the stipulation that the entire building be named in honor of his friend and pastor, President William Faunce. It was only the third student union built in the United States, so the architects improvised, combining in one building the functions of a New York gentlemen's club and a YMCA. Anchoring this corner is the Solomon Center for Teaching, formerly Rogers Hall. It was only the fourth building at Brown and the first to really define what became the eastern wall of College Green. Constructed in 1862 on Brown Street, which then ran straight through the campus, its architect was Alpheus Morse, one of Rhode Island's most prolific and imaginative designers. 17 years later, Morse turned his hand to an even grander commission next door. In counterpoint to University Hall across the way is Sales Hall. It dominates this east wall of the green, a memorial from a father to his son who died while an undergraduate at Brown. It's a massive building, rising up at the crest of the hill like an ocean liner. But even though it overshadows them, it doesn't overpower its neighbors. Original plans called for a brick exterior. In a building this size, that might have been deadly. But then the architect likely saw H.H. Richardson's new Trinity Church in Boston, with its marvelous rough surface, and so the great bulk of Sales Hall became lightened and modulated by this robust, colorful mixture of granite and brownstone. Diagonally across the green from the earliest college buildings is another example of the Brown family's continued generosity. In this case, it was a library and an endowment that would house the remarkable collection of books on Americana assembled by John Carter Brown in the 19th century. The facade mixes styles and traditions in an unusual example of Beaux-Arts classicism. The design of the cresting along the edge of the roof, for example, is both a classical scallop pattern and a reference to the feather headdress of Brazilian Indians, a symbol of what Europeans saw as the exoticism of the Americas.
Inside, the feeling of a 19th century gentleman's private library has been recreated in slightly oversized scale, with Tiffany reading lamps in a cool limestone room.
In 1990, a new wing was added to the library, carefully carrying on the austere elegance of the original facade.
The buildings along George Street are really the final wall of the green, where cloister gives way to community. They provide a visual link with Brown's past and with the domestic architecture of the surrounding neighborhood that grew up alongside the university.
The neighborhood wasn't the only thing that was growing in Brown's early years. The library, as libraries will, was soon bursting the confines of its temple in Manning Hall, So in 1878, a new university library arose on the corner of Prospect and Waterman. What we know today as Robinson Hall is one of the most interesting buildings on the campus, a high Victorian confection of bluestone, terracotta, slate, and metal. Lots of metal. Fire is a librarian's darkest nightmare, and so the builders went to extraordinary lengths to protect Brown's precious books. For example, there is no wood in the building's structure. The walls are 2 feet thick, really 2 brick shells separated by an airspace. The upper floors are cast iron, and on the roof, every one of those slate tiles is attached by its own nut and bolt to a steel frame.
The interior of this fortress is surprisingly light and airy. The idea, a central rotunda with stacks and radiating wings, originated in Europe, and Brown librarian Charles Jewett was one of the first to bring the plan to the United States. It feels Venetian, Moorish, wonderfully eclectic. Robinson Hall has recently been restored to its original colorful splendor.
Fireproof it might have been, but within 30 years, Robinson Hall, too, had seen the library outgrow it. Andrew Carnegie, not a Brown graduate, was cajoled by President Faunce into contributing part of the money for a new library, even though it meant tearing down the president's own house, which then stood on this site at the corner of College and Prospect. What arose in its stead is a dignified, elegant structure. The John Hay Library is inspired by English Renaissance architecture, particularly the urbane buildings of Christopher Wren. It's an interesting choice because it complements University Hall, which is, at heart, a piece of vernacular rural architecture from English sources of the same period. At the end of the 19th century, women had to fight hard to be allowed to study at Brown. Along with the prejudice that was built into society itself, women were seen by some male undergraduates as hazardous distractions from the life of scholarship. "If I met on the campus the right kind of girls," one of them wrote, "the womanly, tender, emotional kind, I am afraid I might get interested in something besides study."
If University Hall is the architectural symbol of Brown's beginnings, then this building, Pembroke Hall, is the symbolic heart of women's presence at Brown. It is quite literally a movement embodied in architecture.
In 1891, there were only 7 women students at Brown. 7 years later, they were over 100. They studied in a kind of limbo, not yet full members of Brown's educational structure, tutored by Brown professors in makeshift quarters. Then Sarah Doyle, an educator and clubwoman, led a drive to raise money for a building that would demonstrate that women were serious about securing an equal education at Brown. President Andrews promised a piece of land, and the community accepted the challenge. Pembroke Hall was dedicated in 1897, named after Roger Williams College at Cambridge, a place, appropriately enough, that had been founded by the wife of the Earl of Pembroke. Formally invited into the university by the corporation, women finally had a place to study, in the daylight at least. In its first years, there was no money for artificial lighting. No matter, Pembroke Hall was proof that women had arrived. Perhaps one detail says it all. Molded into each copper downspout, below the construction date, is a proud B, the monogram of Brown University. In form, it's Elizabethan revival. In spirit, it's serious and dignified.
Inside Alumni Hall, however, there is quite a different feeling. This is one of the most gracious spaces on the Brown campus. Light and airy during the daytime, festive at night with its chandeliers and solemn organ pipes, providing a liberating sense of scale. This has been the site of lectures, dances, concerts, and of course, the exuberant Latin carol service. If Pembroke had a patron saint, it would be Sarah Doyle. So it's appropriate that this little building on Meeting Street, like a gatehouse watching protectively over the entrance to the old Pembroke campus, is today the Sarah Doyle Women's Center at Brown.
Like the stubborn old lady who won't sell out to the skyscraper developers, Sarah Doyle's little house has become the plaza for its giant neighbor, the Grimshaw-Gudowitz Medical Building. It's actually an interesting piece of symbiosis, the smaller structure providing a natural forecourt that admits light and space into the shadow of its giant neighbor. But the juxtaposition in scale and in architectural values between the two buildings illustrates the different way that Brown began thinking about its built environment 40 years ago. It started after the Second World War with a housing crisis and an activist college president. Architecturally and otherwise, it was Henry Riston who propelled Brown into the modern era. The East Side awoke one morning in 1949 to the sound of bulldozers and wrecking cranes. 30 small 19th century buildings went down under the wrecking ball in this ambitious program. Brown needed more dormitory space, and President Riston was determined to move Brown's fraternities onto campus and closer to the administration's watchful eye. The solution to both problems was Riston Quad.
The architects Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn also designed colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. So maybe that's why Riston Quad has a certain theatrical quality to it. Inside, it's a series of small-scale courtyards and semi-detached houses, a sort of artificial colonial streetscape. Although our nation's founding fathers might blush at what goes on in these Georgian courtyards during spring weekend.
Incidentally, among the secret treasures of the Brown campus are these carved stone tablets set out of the way in arches and doorways and gardens of this generation of buildings. They are the late work of the great American calligrapher and stonecutter John Howard Benson.
Here in Benson's vigorous Roman letters at the entrance to Riston Quad is perhaps the most economical tribute to one of Brown's greatest presidents. Si monumentum requiris circumspice. The original is on Christopher Wren's grave in St. Paul's Cathedral, his great church in London. Here it commemorates the vision of Henry Riston. If you need a monument, look around you.
By now, new buildings would have to match the size and ambition of Brown's expanding programs. New architecture on the campus would have to wrestle with the problems of scale and context. The List Art Building is one of the more successful solutions. Philip Johnson, now the grand old man of American architecture, conceived it earlier in his career as a mixture of modern construction and classical references. Like this colossal portico, which here functions as an arcade, as well as a grand classical face to present to the city. From the street, the Geochem building looks like a fortress. The protruding rounded windowsills make the brick walls seem even thicker and more substantial than they are. It turns a friendlier face to its courtyard on the other side, however. The oversized lab windows lighten the mass, and you can look right through the transparent stairwells to the other side. Just opposite, in this new plaza, the Watson Center for Information Technology has become one of the most popular buildings on campus. Like its Geochem neighbor, it turns a cold shoulder to the public street, but its courtyard face is more interesting. Its essential box broken at the corner by a stepped-back series of glass planes.
No matter how successfully these new buildings solve the problems of large-scale architecture, we have to look elsewhere at Brown for, in computer jargon, true user-friendly buildings. You'll find them on the streets of the campus in the shadows of the gigantic buildings demanded by the modern sciences, like mammals scurrying out of the way of dinosaurs. These are Brown's smaller buildings, the houses of the humanities.
And they are, in a curious way, the glory of the Brown campus. Unlike other great universities, like Yale or Columbia, for example, Brown has a wealth of small buildings that move like currents through the campus. They give Brown its special texture, the sense that the university is part of a living neighborhood. The buildings themselves, with their distinctive forms and spaces, come to flavor the pleasures and anxieties of the learning that takes place within them. Some are priceless examples of particular periods and styles. Nicholson House, with its polychrome color scheme, was one of the most elegant urbane houses in Providence when it was built in the 1870s. A splendid example of what Victorians called modern Gothic. Pierce House, now the formidable home of the Applied Math Department, with its massive stone facade and dramatic entrance, is a wonderfully flamboyant example of Richardsonian Romanesque. And Partridge Hall, repainted in its proper exuberant Victorian colors, with its delicate Japanese-influenced porch, is now the Third World Center. It doesn't matter that relatively few students have actually been inside Wilbur Hall, the Department of Egyptology, or that few English majors passing through the curious double doors of the Horace Mann House know that it began life as a duplex apartment house built by the fashionable New York architect Richard Upjohn for fashionable Providence bachelors.
It's enough that the idiosyncratic forms of these buildings add to the richness and color of the streetscape. They provide a visual analog of education, open to diversity and conscious of a sense of history.
The Brown campus is a catalog of architectural taste, and so to the problem of building an annex between quarreling styles, like this addition to the math department's building, sometimes playful exuberance is the only solution.
Away from the central greens and courtyards then, what unifies the Brown campus is its wonderful diversity. It is held together by the streetscape and human scale of one of the greatest historic neighborhoods in the United States. Finally, some of the most satisfying buildings at Brown are those that combine the old and the modern, the creative adaptations which maintain the university's architectural inheritance.
For, first and last, a student experiences Brown through its historic architecture. In this imposing Italianate home, built for George Corliss, one of the great mechanical geniuses of the 19th century, a hopeful applicant faces the rigors of the admission process. Then, years later, the graduate's continuing association with the university will revolve around the Maddock Alumni Center, a sensitive restoration of the elegant 19th century Goddard Iselin mansion. And when it came time to remodel Rogers Hall, for example, the university honored the tradition of the Green's original buildings by preserving the facade. The graceful proportions of the original building are still here, in the windows and the scale, but they've been married to a colorful, ingenious reworking of the interior.
Adapting these historic buildings is not always the easiest solution, and is not always the least expensive solution. But Brown has learned that preserving them is often the only way of holding on to the irreplaceable, the rich fabric of architecture which binds this campus together, and which connects each student to the history and traditions of the college.
I like the fact that many students' most memorable day here derives its shape and meaning from Brown's architecture. Only twice a year are the Van Wickle gates thrown open. Inward, when students arrive in the fall, and then more ceremonially, outward for graduation. At graduation, a senior walks for the last time the heartline of Brown, its oldest architectural axis, from University Hall down College Hill to a wider world.
This is the first stop on that symbolic descent from the hill. In the First Baptist Meeting House, we come full circle, back to the 18th century, to the Brown brothers, and to that peculiar time of religious freedom in which church and state flourished in Rhode Island.
It's not officially a Brown building, but it's bound to the university by tradition and its own charter. It was designed by Joseph Brown and built by his brothers for the worship of Almighty God, and in an unusual secular addendum for holding commencement in. In fact, the church was enlarged during planning because the college's authorities requested it. When it was finished, almost a third of the entire population of the town could worship here.
It's based on a Christopher Wren church, one of the many he designed when he rebuilt London after the Great Fire. Its solemn stone, translated here in the colonies, into graceful wooden forms. Its interior volume, a double cube, echoing the college green's equally satisfying double square. And then comes the final leg of the journey, back to the heart of the campus. As space and as metaphor, Brown's architecture is both the beginning and the end of this richly symbolic passage.
Perhaps President Riston, a man who understood the special allure of Brown's built environment, put it best. "This is a place of beauty and of charm," he once said, "and I do not believe that anybody can walk these walks for 4 years and not have something happen to his heart as well as his head. Think of it, therefore, not alone with affection, but with the sense of responsibility which comes from being a member of a great society.